Here's everything Trump did this week. 1, he shut down the government to avoid extending Obamacare. I know this is going to get me a lot of comments. Okay, so there's this thing called the Affordable Care Act. This is Obamacare. And there are these subsidies that are part of Obamacare that keep people's health insurance lower. The only problem is they're expiring in 2026. So if Congress wants to keep them active, they need to renew them. And if Congress doesn't renew them, then health insurance prices could actually double. Like, this is not a small part of Obamacare. This is a huge, huge program that needs to be renewed. The Republicans in Congress right now don't want to renew these subsidies. They want to let them expire. And in the Senate, remember, you need 60 votes in order to beat a filibuster and actually pass a budget. And this is where the shutdown comes from. Republicans can't get enough votes to cut these Obamacare subsidies. Therefore, neither side can come to an agreement, and we have a government shutdown. There's a lot of misinformation going around on why this shutdown is a thing. I promise you, it is not because people want to give healthcare to illegal immigrants. The Obamacare subsidies in the middle of this have never been available to illegal immigrants. What people are probably referring to is the fact that Democrats want to change a rule having to do with alien Medicaid eligibility. It was in Trump's big, beautiful bill earlier this year, and it basically says that immigrants who are lawfully present in the U.S., just not legal citizens yet, can't access Medicaid. This is the rule that Democrats want to axe. It doesn't have to do with giving illegal immigrants health care. It has to do with giving lawfully present immigrants access to Medicaid. But even with the crazy misinformation that's going on because of this, still more people are going to blame Trump and the Republicans in Congress for this shutdown. The shutdown also just isn't for show. They've gotten so common at this point that we just kind of forget that this actually affects people. A lot of federal workers go without pay and certain very important programs get underfunded. But on the other hand, remember, if Democrats vote with Republicans to strip this Obamacare subsidy, then healthcare prices literally double for a huge amount of people. So this is actually really important. 2, he used the shutdown as justification to defund a bunch of Democratic states and agencies. So there's this guy named Russell Vought. He's an asshole. He was literally the main author of Project 2025. Remember, that's the same thing that all those outlets told us wasn't a problem and that we didn't need to worry about. Well, this guy leads Trump's Office of Management and Budget. And just recently, he met with him to determine which Democrat agencies are getting cut. So far, he's frozen $18 billion in New York City infrastructure funds, $8 billion in climate projects across the US, $2.1 billion in Chicago transit projects. Like, it's very clear that Trump is using this shutdown as justification to just attack Democrats and take away a bunch of funding. Number 3, he deployed the US military to occupy Portland, Oregon. This is obviously just a power play by Trump. Portland, Oregon has a way lower crime rate compared to cities of similar sizes in red states, yet the states Trump sends troops into are blue states, which historically have lower crime rates than a lot of cities in red states. Trump's reasoning for deploying the National Guard is to protect ICE facilities. He says that these facilities are under siege from attack by Antifa, which again isn't a real organization, it's an ideology, so I don't get why so many people are falling for this. He's clearly just trying to throw out buzzwords to scare you. Trump needs an enemy to justify sending these troops to all these cities, and he's chosen this made-up organization called Antifa in order to do that. Number 4, he started forcing colleges to implement his ideology in order to receive funding. Trump has an agreement he's trying to get these universities to sign, and in order to get them to sign it, he's pretty much just bribing them with federal grants. Some of the demands in this agreement include halting all diversity initiatives and hiring and admissions, but also some other stuff like freezing tuition prices, which on the surface seems like a really good thing. However, historically, price caps like this have not worked very well. They usually just result in colleges cutting financial aid, usually to low-income people who need it the most, or just rapidly raising prices right after the cap ends. So it's good that his heart's in the right place, but this probably isn't going to work very well. And it seems to be mainly about DEI and wokeness and all of those buzzwords. Some states are actually fighting back. The governor of California said he was going to cut all state funding to schools who signed this agreement. He says that this threatens academic freedom because it kind of does. Number 5, he made a deal with Pfizer, giving exemptions from tariffs in exchange for lower drug prices. So Trump has announced a new website called Trump RX. He named it after himself, of course. And this website is pretty much going to offer standalone prescription drugs at a lower price. The deal Trump just made with Pfizer is part of this plan. They're essentially going to offer their drugs for a lower price here in exchange for getting exemptions from some of the worst tariffs Trump has put on them. So far, this all sounds great. Okay, Big Pharma is extremely, extremely powerful. So the fact that Trump has managed to get a deal with these people must be a good thing for the public, right? But if this deal was a good thing for the public and a bad thing for Big Pharma, their stocks would not be absolutely skyrocketing right now. There's a few reasons why this is actually better for these pharma companies. First of all, 92% of Americans are already insured, meaning that they're not going to be buying standalone drugs on a website like Trump RX, okay? Not only that, but most people's insurance actually gets them these drugs for cheaper than they would be on this website anyway. And if you don't have insurance but are still able to afford to buy standalone drugs, you're probably wealthy enough to the point where you don't need a handout right now. So not only does it not really help anyone, but it also makes the government pick winners and losers, which is bad. If big pharma companies are the only companies that can get exemptions from these tariffs, then more and more power is just going to be consolidated in these big companies, meaning the only ones that are actually going to get burned are the smaller ones, which aren't the majority of the problem. Not only that, but this deal only lasts 3 years. So if we have a new president in 3 years, hopefully, and they lift all of these tariffs, which are the leverage for Trump getting this deal, then they can just immediately raise the prices again. There's nothing stopping them. So for the most part, this deal is just good news for Big Pharma and does not really help the public at all. Number 6, he stopped enforcing certain consumer protection laws for disabled people. This was a rule introduced by Biden that made airline companies reimburse passengers for increased travel costs if they have a wheelchair. It also makes them reimburse the person if they damage the wheelchair during transport, which I think both of those things are very fair, right? Like, someone in a wheelchair shouldn't have to pay more to fly than someone who's not in a wheelchair. That's just common sense. But Trump has decided that he's not going to be enforcing this rule anymore, which is just something you can do now, apparently. Number 7, he leased out 13.1 million acres of federal land to coal companies. So there's this department within the government called the Department of the Interior, and it basically manages all of our national parks, all of our wildlife refuges, stuff like that. So you would think the person that runs this agency would have something to do with conservation, something to do with protecting the environment. Yeah, absolutely not. This is Doug Burgum, and he is best friends with the oil and gas industry. His campaigns in the past have been funded by them. He's been involved in many of these companies and even gets royalties for some of their success. And this is the person that is now in charge of all of our national parks and federal lands. So it's no wonder that he's leasing out all of our land to coal companies right now. Not only that, but the Department of Energy is also just giving the coal companies $625 million on top of the land. I don't really know how else to spin this, but it is just government corruption. Like, I don't know how you can argue against that. Number 8, he invoked even more tariffs, this time on lumber, cabinets, and furniture. He once again declared that there was a national emergency and said we needed to act fast to save the lumber industry in America. I don't know about you guys, but I do not stay up late at night thinking about the health of the lumber industry in America. I do stay up at night thinking about how the hell I'm gonna afford a home in the future. Home prices have obviously gotten way higher over the last 40, 50 years. And so something that is definitely not going to help that problem is making all of the materials and furnishings of a house more expensive to get. If you increase the price of all of these essential things you need to make a home, obviously home prices are also going to increase. And you can't even argue that this is going to be a short-term loss for a long-term benefit either, because Trump's entire goal with these tariffs is to increase manufacturing jobs in America. And we are currently losing manufacturing jobs in America. Since he invoked his tariffs, we have lost 42,000 jobs. Like, it's not working. We can see that very clearly. And increasing home prices on top of that is not going to be a good thing. Number 9, he once again announced 100% tariffs on foreign movies. Nobody really knows what he means by this because movies aren't a good that we import physically into the US. Very interested to see how that one works out. Number 10, he advanced the decision to end quarterly earnings reports for companies. So every 3 months, US companies need to go on stage and release a quarterly earnings report. This is so investors and the public know how well the company is doing so they can choose whether or not they want to take their money out or keep their money in. And it just overall makes things transparent so people know what's going on with the company and aren't like completely surprised if it goes under. So of course, Trump wants to remove these, or at least make them less frequent. He wants to take them from 4 a year every 3 months to 2 a year every 6 months. He says this will make companies think more long-term and increase the amount of money they can generate, but it also just leads to more illegal activity. If there's less opportunity for people to scrutinize a company's finances, then there's obviously going to be more opportunity for them to do illegal stuff. Number 11, he said he would fire any military leader that he, quote, didn't like. This is pretty self-explanatory. Always a good thing for a leader to do. Yeah, another great decision by President Trump. Number 12, he struck a 4th alleged drug vessel off of Venezuela's coast. Like I said, this is the 4th time that he's done this, and also the 4th time that he's given no evidence that this boat was carrying any drugs. When asked about it, he said there were big bags of cocaine and fentanyl all over the place when the boat was blown up. The only problem is Venezuelan drug gangs don't produce or smuggle fentanyl. So either Trump is lying about it or he just actually doesn't know whether they're drug vessels or not, which I think are equally as bad. Number 13, he scrapped a Justice Department task force that was focused on taking down cartels. He's eliminating 275 positions within this department. This is part of a wider revamp to the DOJ that's more focused on prosecuting his political enemies rather than enforcing the law equally among everyone. Number 14, he ordered that 100 National Guardsmen be sent into Illinois. Very similar to what we talked about earlier, just a power play against the Democratic state. Number 15, he started a process to make Harvard ineligible for federal funding. Trump is claiming that Harvard is discriminating against Jewish students and is using that as justification to take away all of their federal grants. When he talks about discrimination against Jewish students, He's mainly just talking about allowing pro-Palestinian protests on campus. So far, Harvard has been one of the only universities to actually stand up to Trump and stand their ground. But there's also talk of a $500 million settlement between Harvard and Trump, so we're gonna have to see if they actually stick it out or if they just pay him the money. Number 16, he removed a bunch of restrictions on civilian gun exports. These were export bans on a ton of different countries. Their main purpose was to stop guns from getting in the hands of criminals or terrorists, but the Commerce Department says they're more focused on creating hundreds of million dollars per year and export opportunities for companies. Number 17, he offered a ton of unaccompanied minors $2,500 to self-deport themselves. He did something very similar to this in May when he offered people $1,000 to self-deport themselves. But these deportation incentives usually don't really work that well. Let me give you an example. Sweden tried something very similar to this a while back, except they gave people $36,000 to self-deport themselves, which is a huge amount of money. In the entire country of Sweden, while this program was active, only 70 people actually applied to self-deport themselves. And of those applications, only one was ever paid out and accepted. Like, you cannot get much worse than this. This is absolutely insane. Maybe it'll be different in America, who knows, but this is probably not gonna work. And finally, number 18, unveiled a design for a $1 coin with his face on. This is what the coin looks like. It's supposed to be to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the country. Yes, this actually could be minted by the US Treasury. I personally will not be copying. Now onto the court verdicts for Trump this week. The Supreme Court allowed Trump to fire the Education Department's civil rights staff. This was an area of the department focused on enforcing civil rights rules, but now half of the employees are going to be laid off. A judge blocked him from cutting counterterrorism funds in a bunch of blue states. Trump tried to cut $233 million of counterterrorism funds in a bunch of Democratic states like New York and Illinois. But the judge said this violated the Administrative Procedures Act because they did it right before the end of the fiscal year. This was most likely done on purpose so that the funds could expire before anyone could challenge Trump's decision. But the judge agreed to place a temporary hold on this while the case played out. Another judge ruled that Trump targeting pro-Palestinian activists was illegal. Trump has previously revoked a ton of student visas just on the guise of them being pro-Palestinian or having pro-Palestinian views. And the judge argues that this is a violation of freedom of speech because it is. An appeals court rejected Trump's appeal to end birthright citizenship for a second time, which means this most likely can only be decided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court let Trump strip over 300,000 Venezuelans' temporary protected status away. They put a previous judge's ruling on hold, meaning that in the meantime, all of these people are now eligible for deportation. Finally, and very importantly, the Supreme Court allowed Lisa Cook to stay in the Federal Reserve. Trump has been trying to fire this person for a very long time in order to get a majority of votes on the Board of Governors, but the Supreme Court is allowing her to stay on while they work on the full case, which they're going to hear arguments for in January. This is incredibly important because if Trump is able to fire people on the Federal Reserve Board, then he can pretty much control interest rates for the country, which is a crazy amount of power for a president to have. In other news, 4 people were killed at a shooting in a Michigan church last week. The suspect was killed in a shootout shortly after. Some people who have spoken to him in the past said he held anti-Mormon beliefs, but officials are still saying that the motive was unclear. Eric Adams has dropped out of New York City's mayoral race. This tightens Zoran Mamdani's lead a little bit, but he's still well ahead of Andrew Cuomo. We're gonna have to see if Curtis Sliwa drops out and how that affects things. And finally, YouTube has agreed to pay $24.5 million to Trump in order to settle a lawsuit with him. YouTube is now added to the list of companies that have paid Trump money to get out of lawsuits. Meta paid him $25 million. Twitter paid him $10 million. Now YouTube has paid him $24.5 million. It was going to be interesting to see if YouTube would be the one to stand up to him, but apparently everyone is just kind of rolling over. Now for our weekly trackers. Inflation is at 2.9%. That is still well above what it should be at. Around 2% is a healthy level. We can probably expect this to go up in the future since the Fed is now cutting interest rates rather than holding them. Unemployment is at 4.3%. This is still pretty healthy. Egg prices are at $3.59 a dozen, which is still very high, but lower than they were earlier in the year. Gas is at $3.30, still pretty high. And so far during his term, Trump has spent $89,600,000 on golf trips. For reference, this is more than twice as much as Obama spent at this point in his presidency, and more than Biden spent during his entire presidency. So that is where things stand this week. Thank you for sitting through this incredibly boring slideshow presentation, and I hope you have a great day. There's a train. You know, you wouldn't think there'd be a train, but look at it, there's a train. And it's beautiful, it's a beautiful train. One of the most beautiful trains, I'd say. You look at a train, you say, wow, that's a train. You know, Jeffrey Epstein, he'd ram his train into me.